Welcome to History Reimagined channel. Subscribe now so you don't miss more videos like this one.
Jesse James lies in his coffin following his 1882 killing by Robert Ford. The outlaw's body was publicly displayed to prove his death, yet rumors of survival persisted for decades, with over 20 men later claiming to be Jesse James. A Western saloon woman plays dice in an early 20th century portrait. Female saloon workers occupied a uniquely precarious social position, simultaneously providing essential frontier entertainment, while being excluded from the respectable society that depended on their economic contributions. A woman plays billiards in a Western saloon in the late 19th century. Billiard tables were among the most expensive items frontier saloon owners purchased, costing more than the entire building, yet considered essential for attracting the respectable clientele operators desperately sought. Deadwood, South Dakota celebrates its 25th anniversary in 1901. Founded illegally on Lakota treaty land during the 1876 Black Hills Gold Rush, it became the Wild West's most notorious boomtown, home to Wild Bill Hickok's murder. The Tollgate Saloon operates in Black Hawk, Colorado in 1897. Mining boomtowns averaged one saloon per 50 male residents, with gambling and alcohol defining frontier social life before territorial law enforcement gradually established order. Cowboys water horses at a Dodge City trough around 1900. Between 1875 to 1885, approximately 5 million longhorn cattle passed through Dodge City along the Chisholm Trail before railroad expansion permanently ended the Great American Cattle Drives. 4 Crow Scouts photographed at Little Bighorn in 1908. They had warned Custer of overwhelming Lakota numbers before the 1876 battle, advice he fatally ignored, making them eyewitnesses to his catastrophic arrogance and total defeat. A train stops at Boise's Oregon Short Line Depot between 1880 to 1900. The railroad's 1887 arrival transformed Idaho from isolated frontier into viable statehood, cutting transcontinental travel from months by wagon to mere days by rail. Rose Dunn, Rose of Cimarron, poses with her revolver in the 1890s. She harbored lover George Bittercreek, Newcomb of the Doolin-Dalton gang, reportedly smuggling ammunition to him during the deadly 1893 Ingalls gunfight against U.S. Marshals. Quanah Parker, last Comanche chief, photographed in Oklahoma around 1890. Son of captive white woman Cynthia Ann Parker, he never lost a battle against U.S. forces yet successfully led his people's peaceful transition into reservation life. A mustachioed frontier man poses beside his revolver. Colt's 1873 single-action army became the West's defining weapon, with over 37,000 produced in its first decade, earning the legendary nickname, the gun that won the West. An 1850s American frontier hunter carries deer antlers and his long rifle. Professional hunters supplied eastern markets with millions of hides annually, contributing to wildlife collapse so severe that American bison fell from 30 million to under 1,000. Goldfield, Nevada's Main Street, photographed in 1905. At its peak, Goldfield produced $11 million in gold annually, briefly becoming Nevada's largest city before the ore ran out, leaving behind one of America's most complete ghost town landscapes. Miners camp outside their Sierra Nevada cabin in 1866. California's gold rush had peaked 15 years earlier, yet thousands of prospectors still worked marginal claims, living in primitive conditions while hydraulic mining companies destroyed entire mountainsides for industrial-scale extraction. Delia Albert, a Toawa woman, blends traditional and Western dress in 1890 California. This hybrid clothing reflected the impossible position of California's surviving indigenous peoples, forced to adopt settler culture while quietly preserving fragments of their nearly destroyed ancestral identity. Pawnee Chief Petalisharo II, known as Man Chief, photographed in Washington, D.C. around 1858. Leader of the Chowie Band and the Pawnee Confederation, he negotiated desperately to protect tribal lands as American westward expansion systematically dismantled Plains indigenous sovereignty. 40 indigenous canoes lined the Daya Riverbank in Alaska during the 1897 Klondike Gold Rush. Native Alaskans became indispensable freight transporters, charging prospectors premium rates, briefly gaining economic leverage over the same settlers who were displacing their communities. Burlington Locomotive No. 7 arrives at Broken Bow, Nebraska around 1886. The 440 American Standard wheel configuration powered most 19th-century passenger trains, its design so reliable that railroads operated them profitably for over 4 decades across the expanding American frontier. Locomotive No. 197 hauls passengers near Pitkin, Colorado in 1895. Colorado's mountain railroads conquered grades that engineers deemed impossible, with some lines gaining 2,000 feet of elevation per mile, using switchbacks that required trains to reverse direction repeatedly to climb. Dominic John Ali, cowboy poet, photographed in 1896. The American West's cattle drives created a rich oral poetry tradition among cowboys who composed verses during long, lonely night watches, a literary form that survives today in annual cowboy poetry gatherings. Elkhart, Texas's wooden Main Street, photographed in 1870. Frontier Texas towns were built almost entirely from lumber hauled hundreds of miles, making fire the constant existential threat that destroyed and rebuilt most Western commercial districts multiple times within single decades. Native Americans in ceremonial dress gather on arid plains. The U.S. government banned indigenous spiritual ceremonies and traditional clothing on reservations throughout the 1880s, making such gatherings acts of quiet cultural defiance. Officers' quarters at Camp Apache, Arizona Territory, photographed in 1871. Established in 1870 to control White Mountain Apache lands, the camp later became Fort Apache, where Apache scouts paradoxically helped the U.S. Army defeat their own people's resistance movements. Colorado coal miners pose outside their stone and mud cabin. Company towns controlled every aspect of miners' lives, paying wages in scrip redeemable only at company stores, creating debt bondage that trapped generations of immigrant families in permanent poverty. Alexander Gardner photographed the J.M. Webster family in Wyandotte, Kansas in 1867. Gardner, famous for his Civil War battlefield photography, documented Reconstruction-era frontier families as America struggled to rebuild national identity following 4 years of devastating conflict. Body, California's Mono County Bank, photographed around 1880. Body produced $34 million in gold and silver during its peak years, yet by 1915 was completely abandoned, becoming California's most authentically preserved ghost town, surviving virtually untouched today. Umatilla tribal members stand beside traditional teepees on the Columbia River in 1922. The Columbia was so central to their salmon-based culture that the tribe legally retained fishing rights there, even after losing 6 million acres of ancestral homeland. In early 20th century England, Christmas tradition required wives to kneel before husbands, seeking forgiveness for the year's transgressions. This ritual reflected Victorian marriage's legal reality, where wives had virtually no independent legal standing or property rights whatsoever. Pioneer families traveled the Oregon Trail by covered wagon in the 19th century. The 2,000-mile journey killed 1 in 10 travelers, mostly from cholera, with wagon ruts so deep they remain visible in Wyoming and Idaho landscapes today. Annie Oakley shoots backwards using a hand mirror in 1899. Buffalo Bill's star performer could split a playing card edge on at 30 paces. Skills developed hunting to feed her family after her father died when she was 6. Gordon Pawnee Bill Lilly and wife May, photographed in Pawnee, Oklahoma in 1886. Pawnee Bill's Wild West show eventually merged with Buffalo Bill's iconic troupe, creating the era's largest traveling entertainment spectacle, reaching millions of American and European audiences. Men pose inside a Virginia City, Nevada saloon in March 1898. Nevada's Comstock lobed silver rush created instant cities where saloons served as banks, courtrooms, and community centers during the chaotic years before formal civic institutions could be established. A pioneer family poses with their covered wagon on the Oregon Trail in 1890. By this date, the trail was largely obsolete, replaced by transcontinental railroads, making this one of the final photographs documenting America's great overland migration era. A mountain of bison skulls towers outside Michigan Carbon Works in 1892. Approximately 60 million bison roamed North America in 1800. Commercial hunting reduced the population to under 1,000 by 1889, deliberately starving Plains indigenous nations into submission. Jenny Botter's Jerome, Arizona brothel photographed in 1898. Jenny survived 2 fires destroying previous buildings on this site before being murdered in 1905, by which point she had accumulated enough wealth to be considered Arizona Territory's richest woman. John Delane's wagon shop and Eureka horse shoeing forge, photographed in Broken Bow, Nebraska around 1889, blacksmiths and wagon makers were frontier towns' most essential businesses, their skills literally keeping agricultural communities moving, before automobile technology made them obsolete. Trappers and hunters photographed themselves in Arizona's Four Peaks country in Browns Basin. Professional mountain men supplied eastern fur markets until beaver hat fashions collapsed in the 1840s, forcing survivors to reinvent themselves as Army scouts and frontier guides. Armed Cayetero Apache warriors photographed near Camp Apache, Arizona in 1873. The Cayetero Band had recently been relocated to the newly created White Mountain Reservation, their weapons reflecting ongoing tensions with both neighboring tribes and encroaching American settlers. 3 prospectors work a sluice box separating gold from gravel during America's gold rush. Sluicing replaced individual gold panning as miners realized channeled water could process hundreds of times more material, though mercury contamination from the process persists environmentally today. President Theodore Roosevelt visits Wallace, Idaho in 1903. The town sat at the center of America's richest silver-lead mining district, where Roosevelt's growing conservation philosophy would soon clash directly with mining industry interests over public lands management. The Chrisman sisters, Harriet, Elizabeth, Lucy, and Ruth, stand outside their sod house in Custer County, Nebraska in 1886. Women filed 12% of Homestead Act claims independently, using the law's gender-neutral language to legally own land for the first time. A pioneer family rests beside their covered wagon at Three Rivers Range, New Mexico in 1908. By this date, most frontier land had been claimed, making these late homesteaders among the final participants in America's closing Western settlement era. Leadville, Colorado, photographed in the 1800s. Founded in 1877, Leadville briefly became Colorado's second largest city, producing $200 million in silver, attracting figures including Doc Holliday and Oscar Wilde, before ore depletion transformed it into a struggling mountain community. Mary E. Jacobson photographed San Antonio's Commerce Street in the 1880s before pavement existed. Her documentation captured the last years of San Antonio's frontier character, before the railroad's arrival transformed the former Spanish mission town into a modern American city. Two Ruby Hill Railroad steam locomotives served Nevada's Eureka mining district in the early 1890s. Eureka's silver boom produced $40 million between 1869 to 1885, supporting its own railroad, smelters, and opera house before ore exhaustion ended the boomtown era. A Colorado sex worker poses before a Victorian studio backdrop around 1900. Frontier prostitution was so economically vital that many Western towns officially taxed brothels, with some female proprietors accumulating enough wealth to become their region's most significant property owners. Chinese laborers photographed in California in 1898. Approximately 20,000 Chinese workers built the Transcontinental Railroad's Central Pacific section. Yet the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act rewarded their contributions by banning further Chinese immigration for over 6 decades afterward. A Navajo family sits beneath a tree in Monument Valley in the 1960s. The Navajo Nation covers 17.5 million acres across 3 states, making it America's largest tribal reservation. Yet unemployment exceeded 50% throughout this entire decade of the photograph. A tintype portrait captures 21-year-old James Butler Hickok in Lawrence, Kansas in 1858, 17 years before his murder during a poker game in Deadwood. This image shows Wild Bill Hickok before becoming the West's most celebrated lawman and gunfighter. Apache men pose outside their dwellings in the American West in 1902. By this date, the Apache had been confined to reservations for 16 years following Geronimo's 1886 surrender, ending centuries of independent existence across the Sonoran Desert Southwest. A frontier hunter sits with his rifle and fur pelts in a classic sepia portrait. Professional mountain men supplied Eastern fashion markets with beaver, bear, and fox furs, until the 1840s collapse of fur hat fashions ended their entire way of life. Farmers stack alfalfa hay at Stockdale Ranch in Kern County, California in the 1890s. Horse-powered hay derricks could lift and stack loads impossible by hand, revolutionizing California's agricultural productivity as irrigation transformed the Central Valley into America's most productive farmland. An Indigenous family poses with their horse-drawn wagon in North Dakota in 1883, just 2 years after the Dakota Territory's indigenous nations had been forced onto reservations. This image documents their rapid adoption of settler transportation technology for basic survival. A sex worker poses inside a Western brothel around 1880. Frontier prostitution was so widespread that Dodge City's census recorded more women working in brothels than in any other single occupation, reflecting the extreme gender imbalance of Cattletown demographics. A Wells Fargo stagecoach carries freight through a western town in the late 19th century. Wells Fargo operated over 3,000 offices across the American West by 1866, becoming so essential that outlaws robbing its coaches were considered attacking civilization itself. Butte, Montana. Underground miners eat lunch by candlelight in 1905. Miners placed candles beneath their tin lunch pails to warm food during breaks, a practical innovation in mines where workers spent entire shifts in temperatures never exceeding 50 degrees Fahrenheit. 14 passengers ride atop a stagecoach at Dakota's Hot Springs in an 1889 Grobel photograph. Overloaded coaches navigating mountain switchbacks at full speed represented such extreme danger that passengers regularly signed informal waivers accepting responsibility for their own safety. Black Hill stagecoaches line up in Deadwood, South Dakota in the 1890s. These coaches carried not just passengers, but gold shipments worth millions, making Deadwood's route one of the most frequently robbed and heavily guarded stagecoach lines in American history. An Indigenous warrior stands in traditional dress holding his ceremonial staff. Late 19th century portrait photographers frequently staged such images for Eastern audiences, who consumed romanticized, vanishing Indian imagery as the U.S. government actively destroyed the cultures being photographed. A Cheyenne man poses with his 2 wives, 2 daughters, and son in Montana in 1901. The Cheyenne had been confined to reservations for over 2 decades, following their defeat at the 1876 Battle of Little Bighorn, alongside Sitting Bull. John Graybill photographs the famous Deadwood coach in 1889. This legendary stagecoach survived dozens of robbery attempts while carrying gold shipments along the Black Hills route, its bullet-scarred wooden body becoming one of the American West's most storied artifacts. Wagon train camps at Otto Valley, Colorado in 1890. By this date, most prime homestead land had been claimed, forcing late settlers into increasingly marginal terrain where crop failures and isolation drove abandonment rates exceeding 50% within 5 years. J.R. Watkins, traveling salesman, visits a North Dakota farm around 1900. Watkins' door-to-door salesmen became essential rural lifelines, delivering medicines, spices, and household products to isolated homesteaders living days from the nearest general store. The Hatfield family poses together in 1888. The infamous Hatfield-McCoy feud had reached its bloodiest period just months earlier, with 12 family members killed during the New Year's Night massacre. Yet the family presents themselves with remarkable composed Victorian dignity. A massive sandstorm engulfs Texas farmland on February 20th, 1894, decades before the 1930s. Dust Bowl Great Plains farmers already experienced catastrophic wind erosion from overgrazing and dry farming practices that would eventually destroy millions of acres of topsoil. Oglala Sioux chief Tasunka Kokipapi stands before Pine Ridge Taipis in 1891. His name, meaning "they even fear his horse," was mistranslated on the photograph itself as "young man afraid of his horse," an error repeated in history books for generations. Cowboys drive a massive cattle herd across Dakota Territory grasslands in a John Grabble photograph. The Great Cattle Drives moved 10 million longhorns from Texas to Kansas railheads between 1867 to 1886, permanently transforming American beef consumption and cowboy cultural mythology. A devastating sandstorm buries Midland, Texas farmland in 1894. These recurring Great Plains dust storms resulted from overgrazing destroying native grasses that had anchored topsoil for millennia, foreshadowing the catastrophic 1930s Dust Bowl that displaced 3.5 million Americans. Armed women pose on a frontier cabin balcony in period dress. Frontier women regularly handled firearms out of necessity, with many homesteading wives defending their families and livestock alone for months, while husbands worked distant seasonal employment. Bill Doolin's bullet-riddled body, photographed after his August 25, 1896 killing by U.S. Marshals, leader of the notorious Doolin-Dalton gang. He had evaded capture for years before lawman Heck Thomas finally tracked him down near Lawson, Oklahoma Territory. Cheyenne chiefs Standing Elk, Running Hog, and Little Wolf meet a U.S. government official in South Dakota around 1887. Their ceremonial dress and rifles signaled simultaneous respect for diplomacy and readiness to defend tribal interests during treaty renegotiations. Hopi girl Mashonga wears her traditional squash blossom hairstyle at Oribe, Arizona around 1898. This distinctive double-lobed style indicated unmarried status among Hopi women, with girls adopting it at puberty and abandoning it upon marriage for different traditional styles. A settler family lives in a temporary canvas tent shelter in early 20th century New Mexico. Many homesteaders spent their first years in dugouts or tents before accumulating enough resources to build permanent structures, with families sometimes occupying temporary shelters for decades. Deadwood Central Railroad engineers survey with measuring equipment in 1888. The Black Hills' rugged terrain made railroad construction extraordinarily expensive, requiring engineers to design switchbacks and tunnels through solid granite to connect Deadwood's gold mines with national rail networks. a man marks Lieutenant John Jordan Crittenden, the Third's grave at Little Bighorn in 1876. Crittenden, just 22 years old, was among 268 soldiers killed with Custer, his family having specifically requested he be buried where he fell rather than repatriated. Chinese miners work placer claims in Tuolumne County, California around 1866. Approximately 25,000 Chinese gold miners worked California's fields. Yet the 1850 foreign miners tax, specifically targeting Chinese and Latino workers, extracted millions to fund California's early state government. A Matador Ranch cowboy leads the chuck wagon across Texas grassland. The Matador Ranch once covered 3 million acres across 5 Texas counties, employing hundreds of cowboys who worked cattle drives, supplying beef to markets across the United States and Britain. A woman and horse leap over a car at a California rodeo in 1934. Depression-era rodeos attracted massive audiences seeking affordable entertainment, with female trick riders earning equal billing to male cowboys as the sport's most spectacular, crowd-pleasing performers. A wanted poster features outlaw Jesse James. The Missouri bank robber became America's first celebrity criminal, with sympathetic newspapers portraying him as a Robin Hood figure, despite evidence he kept all stolen money exclusively for himself and his gang. A horse-drawn freight wagon rumbles through Virginia City, Nevada around 1866. At its Comstock load peak, Virginia City supported 25,000 residents, 4 banks, 6 churches, and 110 saloons, making it the American West's most densely developed and culturally sophisticated mining city. Settlers flee during Minnesota's Dakota War of 1862. The 6-week uprising by Dakota Sioux against broken treaty promises killed 600 settlers and led to the largest mass execution in U.S. history, with 38 Dakota men hanged simultaneously in Mankato. Muller Saloon stands in Ripon, Wisconsin in 1894. Midwestern saloons served as immigrant community centers where German, Scandinavian, and Irish settlers preserved native language newspapers, fraternal organizations, and cultural traditions while adapting to American frontier life. Miners McMillan and Hubbard display their deer hunt near Deadwood during the winter of 1887 to 88. Black Hills miners supplemented meager wages through hunting, with venison providing essential protein during brutal South Dakota winters when supply wagon routes became impassable. Dogs hold deep cultural significance for the Uinta Ute people, photographed around the 1870s. Before horses arrived in the 1700s, dogs were the only domesticated animals Plains tribes possessed, pulling travois loads and serving as camp sentinels for centuries. Blackfoot people use horse-drawn travois around 1900. This ingenious transport technology predated horse domestication, originally pulled by dogs, allowing Plains nomads to relocate entire villages within hours as they followed seasonal bison migrations across vast territories. A wagon train forged the Platte River in Nebraska along the Oregon Trail around 1870. The shallow but treacherous Platte crossings claimed hundreds of pioneer lives, with quicksand, flash floods, and capsized wagons representing the trail's most consistently deadly hazard. The Wild Bunch poses for a Fort Worth photographer around 1900. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid's Fatal Mistake was distributing copies as souvenirs, allowing a lawman to recognize them and alert Pinkerton agents who printed wanted posters across the West. Cowboys gather with horses and chuck wagons on western rangeland in the late 19th century. The average trail drive employed 10 to 15 cowboys managing 2,000 to 3,000 cattle over 1,500 miles, paying wages of just $1 per day for 3 months of grueling work. The Deadwood coach photographed by John Grabill in Deadwood, South Dakota, around 1889. This legendary vehicle traveled further than any other stagecoach, accompanying Buffalo Bill's Wild West show across America and Europe, carrying royalty including England's Queen Victoria as passengers. Blackfeet people traveled by horse-drawn travois through dramatic Rocky Mountain scenery in the early 20th century. The poles doubling as teepee frame supports represented ingenious resource efficiency, allowing nomadic bands to carry their entire home structure during seasonal migrations. Western Nebraska deer hunters pose outside their log cabin around 1890. Frontier hunting provided essential food security for isolated homesteaders, with many families surviving harsh Nebraska winters almost entirely on venison, when crop failures eliminated their primary food sources. Belle Starr, the bandit queen, photographed before her 1889 murder, convicted of horse theft, and romantically linked to multiple outlaws including Jesse James, she ran a refuge for fugitives in Indian Territory and became the West's most celebrated female criminal. One of Telluride, Colorado's earliest photographs taken around 1880, within a decade Telluride became Colorado's most important mining city, its gold and silver production funding the construction of the world's first alternating current power transmission system in 1891. Judge Roy Bean poses outside his saloon courthouse bearing "Law West of the Pecos" signage. Bean dispensed frontier justice from his Langtree, Texas saloon, reportedly conducting trials while simultaneously serving whiskey, with his verdicts impossible to appeal given the region's isolation. Texas Rangers and Western gunfighters practiced instinct shooting rather than deliberate aiming. This technique, developed through thousands of repetitions, prioritized first-shot accuracy over raw speed, contradicting Hollywood depictions of fast-draw duels where speed alone determined survival outcomes. A chuck wagon sits ready during a Texas cattle roundup around 1900. The chuck wagon, invented by cattleman Charles Goodnight in 1866, revolutionized long-distance cattle drives by providing mobile kitchens that could feed cowboys hot meals across thousands of roadless miles. Men operate a hydraulic mining pump at Rockerville, South Dakota. Hydraulic mining used pressurized water jets to dissolve entire hillsides, processing millions of cubic yards of gravel for gold, but causing such catastrophic environmental destruction that California banned it in 1884. Blackfeet men photographed in Glacier National Park around 1915. The Great Northern Railway had hired Blackfeet people as tourist attractions, just years after their ancestral lands became the park, commodifying the same culture that federal policies had systematically attempted to destroy. Fireman's Block Street in Austin, Nevada, photographed around 1880. Austin's 1862 silver discovery triggered Nevada's second major rush, briefly making it the state's largest city before the Comstock lode's greater riches redirected prospectors toward Virginia City and the Washoe Valley. 3 prospectors pan for gold while their dog watches in an American mining camp. Gold panning required extraordinary patience, with experienced miners processing hundreds of pounds of gravel daily to recover perhaps a few grams of gold dust worth a few dollars. A crowded passenger stagecoach operates in Ely, Nevada, around 1906 during a railroad celebration. Ely's copper mines, discovered in 1900, transformed the isolated Nevada town into a boom town, just as railroads were making stagecoaches commercially obsolete across the American West. Gertrude Casebeer photographs Iron White Man, a Lakota elder, in 1900. Casebeer's portraits treated native subjects with unprecedented dignity, contrasting sharply with contemporaries who photographed indigenous people as anthropological curiosities rather than complex human beings. Ute warrior Gray Eagle and wife Honeydew of the Mountains ride through Utah's Wasatch Mountains around 1874. The Ute had mastered horsemanship after acquiring horses in the 1640s, becoming the first Great Basin people to develop fully equestrian culture. A couple's horse-drawn carriage passes through a massive hollowed coastal redwood tree. California's drive-through trees became popular tourist attractions in the 1880s, as railroads marketed the Pacific Coast's giant sequoias to eastern visitors seeking proof of California's extraordinary natural wonders. Kingston, New Mexico's Main Street, photographed in 1909. Once a booming silver mining town of 7,000 residents in the 1880s, Kingston had collapsed to near abandonment by this date, following silver price crashes that destroyed New Mexico's entire mining economy overnight. 3 women and a man ride side saddle in military uniform at Fort Verde, Arizona between 1884 to 1887. Women riding side saddle in military formation reflected the period's rigid gender conventions, even as frontier conditions demanded increasingly practical adaptations to conventional Victorian social expectations. Ox-drawn freight wagons haul supplies through the Black Hills of South Dakota in the late 19th century. Oxen were preferred over horses for heavy freight because they cost less, ate cheaper food, and maintained stamina better across rough, unmaintained frontier roads. A burro delivers water through Greaterville, Arizona in 1902. In arid mining towns where wells were scarce, water carriers charged premium prices, with some southwestern communities paying more per gallon for drinking water than they paid for the whiskey served in saloons. Timothy O'Sullivan photographs everyday Navajo life near Fort Defiance, New Mexico, in 1873. O'Sullivan's survey photographs documented Navajo weaving traditions that had survived the catastrophic 1864 to 1868 Long Walk imprisonment, during which 10,000 Navajo were forcibly marched to Bosque Redondo. Wild Bunch members, including Harry Longabaugh and Butch Cassidy, gather outside a Western saloon in 1889. The gang's celebrated Fort Worth photograph, taken just years later, would ironically become the evidence leading Pinkerton detectives to identify and pursue them relentlessly. A settler searches for available town lots during an Oklahoma land rush around the 1890s. The 1889 Oklahoma land run opened 2 million acres in a single day, with 50,000 settlers racing to claim 160-acre homesteads simultaneously at a pistol shot. Santa Fe, New Mexico's Main Street, photographed around 1890. Founded by Spanish colonists in 1610, Santa Fe is America's oldest state capital. Its adobe architecture and plaza unchanged for centuries, despite becoming a U.S. territory following the Mexican-American War. Klondike gold seekers camp at Skagway, Alaska in 1897. Skagway transformed from a single homestead to a city of 10,000 virtually overnight, with crime so rampant that conman Soapy Smith ran the entire town through extortion before his 1898 shooting. 3 elegantly dressed women stroll through Marshall, Texas in 1899. Marshall served as Confederate Louisiana's wartime capital after New Orleans fell. Its prosperous antebellum cotton economy funding the elaborate Victorian fashions that distinguished East Texas society from rougher western frontier communities. Big Nose George Parrott photographed before his 1881 Wyoming lynching. After his execution, physician John Osborne famously had Parrott's skin tanned into leather, crafting shoes he wore to his gubernatorial inauguration, one of the West's most macabre historical footnotes. A train crosses a Kansas River Railroad bridge in 1867. This crossing represented the Union Pacific Eastern Division's advance westward, with railroad construction crews laying up to 8 miles of track daily across Kansas prairies to reach Denver by 1870. James B. Jim Hawkins, founder of Texas Rangers Company D, photographed in 1875. The Rangers were reorganized that year under the Frontier Battalion Act, specifically to combat Comanche raids, Mexican border conflicts, and the explosive wave of outlaw activity plaguing post-war Texas. A family poses with their hunting trophies in Cloud County, Washington in 1909. Market hunting had been largely eliminated by this date following federal game protection laws, making this family's rural subsistence hunting among the last legally unrestricted harvest traditions remaining. Campers gather outdoors in the late 19th century. Recreational camping emerged as a middle-class leisure activity in the 1870s when writers like John Muir romanticized wilderness experience, directly inspiring the conservation movement that created America's national park system under Theodore Roosevelt. Ralph Madsen, known as the Texas Giant, stood over 7 feet 6 inches tall and weighed 230 pounds. One of America's tallest documented men, his extraordinary height made him a celebrated curiosity during an era when such physical anomalies drew enormous public fascination. Tombstone, Arizona's cosmopolitan hotel, under construction in 1880, the town's first two-story building, rose just months before the October 1881 OK Corral gunfight that made Tombstone internationally famous, attracting thousands of tourists who transformed the mining town into legend. Buffalo Bill Cody, bison hunter, U.S., Army Scout, and global entertainer, launched his Wild West show in 1883, touring America and Europe for 3 decades and introducing hundreds of millions of people to romanticized frontier mythology that permanently shaped Western cultural identity. Gold Reef, Nevada's first business, photographed in October 1908. The mines proved far less profitable than prospectors had hoped, and the town completely vanished within years, becoming one of hundreds of Nevada ghost towns abandoned when mining dreams failed to materialize. Pinkerton's 1893 mugshot captures outlaw Laura Bullion, alias Della Rose. The Wild Bunch gang member reportedly disguised herself as a man during heists, making her one of the American West's most audacious female criminals before her eventual arrest and imprisonment. A man stands outside his Arkansas cabin in Hot Springs, Arkansas, in 1901. His moonshine still openly displayed despite Prohibition being 2 decades away, reflecting the Deep South's long tradition of defying federal liquor regulations that locals considered unconstitutional government overreach. Mescalero Apache dancers performed the Mountain Spirit Dance in New Mexico in 1899. This sacred ceremony invokes the Gahan spirits to heal the sick and protect the tribe, a tradition the U.S. government actively suppressed until the 1978 American Indian Religious Freedom Act. Calamity Jane visits Wild Bill Hickok's Deadwood grave shortly before her own death on August 1, 1903. Per her dying request, she was buried beside Hickok despite having exaggerated their romantic relationship for decades in her self-promotional frontier autobiography. Hunters and their dogs pose outside a log cabin near Craig, Colorado, around 1899. Northwestern Colorado's remote mountains harbored some of the West's last unhunted game populations, attracting professional hunters whose harvests supplied urban restaurants and eastern markets with exotic frontier wildlife. A Tlingit woman wears a nose ring and bear claw crown in 1906. The Tlingit of Southeast Alaska developed one of North America's most sophisticated artistic traditions, their clan system and potlatch ceremonies representing complex wealth redistribution economies that sustained coastal communities for millennia. A Paiute camp at Kanash, Utah shows families before traditional teepees and wickiups in the late 19th century. The Paiute had been devastated by Mormon settlement, their pine nut harvesting grounds converted to livestock grazing that eliminated their primary winter food source. A Paiute family stands before their reed house near Fallon, Nevada, around 1907. The northern Paiute had been forcibly removed from their ancestral Pyramid Lake homeland in 1860 following conflicts with settlers who dammed their salmon-rich rivers, destroying their traditional food economy. General George Custer examines maps with Native scouts including Arikara Sioux tracker Bloody Knife around 1875 in Dakota Territory. Bloody Knife would die alongside Custer at Little Bighorn just 1 year later, his fate symbolizing the tragic position of Indigenous men who served their conquerors. Sunflower, a Dakota or Hunkpapa Lakota Sioux member, photographed by Herman Hayne at Omaha's 1899 Indian Congress. This gathering assembled hundreds of Indigenous people from across North America in a commercial exposition that simultaneously celebrated and commodified Native American cultural traditions. Billy the Kid, born November 23, 1859, became the West's most mythologized outlaw, credited with 21 kills before Sheriff Pat Garrett shot him at age 21, though historians document only 8 confirmed deaths, most occurring during New Mexico's bloody Lincoln County War. Settlers pose outside their sod home in Aberdeen, South Dakota in 1892. Sod houses were built from blocks of native grassroot-bound earth, since timber was scarce on the treeless plains, providing surprisingly effective insulation, but harboring insects, snakes, and constant roof leaks. An unidentified Confederate officer performs the thumbing nose gesture in an 1863 photograph. This contemptuous gesture dates to at least the 17th century, reportedly used by Shakespeare himself, making this Civil War soldier's cheeky defiance part of a centuries-old tradition of irreverence. The famous Deadwood coach photographed by John Grabille in Deadwood, South Dakota around 1889. This legendary stagecoach traveled across America and Europe with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, surviving more attempted robberies than any other vehicle in frontier transportation history. Captured during 1878 beneath Fort McKavett, Captain Dan Roberts' legendary Texas Rangers solemnly camp, their rugged silhouettes powerfully embodying the dangerous, deeply untamed frontier spirit fiercely defining 19th century America. Brutally gunned down by Tucson lawmen, notorious stagecoach robber Bill Brazelton hauntingly displays his infamous mask, profoundly symbolizing the violent, desperately ruthless justice violently consuming America's fiercely untamed western frontier. Gathering around their rugged chuck wagon during 1890, resilient Texas XYT Ranch Cowboys quietly share breakfast, beautifully immortalizing the profoundly grueling, enduringly romantic brotherhood defining America's fading wild western landscapes. Conquering California's majestic Sierra Nevada summit during 1864, adventurous riders beautifully project a profoundly epic presence, powerfully symbolizing humanity's relentless, visionary ambition, triumphing across America's terrifyingly vast, unconquered western mountain frontiers. Plunging 850 feet inside Colorado's treacherous Hubert mine during 1895, brave underground laborers profoundly embody the terrifyingly dark, remarkably brutal human sacrifices relentlessly fueling America's dazzling industrial revolution. Dressed proudly in untamed wilderness pelts, legendary 19th century California frontiersman Seth Kinman profoundly immortalizes the fiercely rugged, remarkably resilient pioneering spirit boldly conquering America's beautifully dangerous western territorial frontiers. Masterfully captured by Timothy O'Sullivan during 1873, resilient Navajo weavers gracefully operate traditional upright looms, beautifully symbolizing indigenous cultural endurance surviving majestically amidst New Mexico's profoundly harsh, rapidly shifting colonial landscapes. Posing cautiously alongside Apache youth inside Geronimo's rugged camp, captive white boy Jimmy McKinn profoundly illustrates the terrifyingly complex, deeply intertwined cultural collisions, fiercely defining America's devastatingly violent 19th century borderlands. Pausing proudly beside their wooden chuck wagon during the 1880s, authentic Western cowboys wearing iconic Stetson hats beautifully immortalize the deeply romanticized, remarkably grueling cinematic mythology defining America's historic frontier identity. Proudly overlooking Montana's breathtakingly vast valleys during 1908, four majestic mounted Assiniboine warriors beautifully project a profoundly enduring ancestral strength, heroically defying their rapidly fading, tragically colonized indigenous historic landscape. Heavily armed inside New Mexico's Fort Bayard circa 1884, five fierce Apache scouts wearing ancient war caps profoundly symbolize the terrifyingly complex, deeply conflicted military alliances ruthlessly defining America's frontier expansion. Crowding Colorado's bustling Creed Railroad Station circa 1895, countless eager passengers profoundly embody the dizzying, spectacularly hopeful massive human migrations, furiously driving America's relentless, visionary, industrial, late 19th century Western expansion. masterfully captured during 1888. This remarkably tranquil wooden frontier homestead beautifully immortalizes the incredibly harsh, profoundly resilient pioneering families, valiantly carving fragile, hopeful civilizations across America's terrifyingly vast, untamed western landscapes. Located within bustling 1892 Cripple Creek, this notoriously glamorous brothel profoundly highlights the beautifully dangerous, morally ambiguous underground economy thriving fiercely alongside America's spectacularly brutal, endlessly desperate western gold rush frontiers. Standing proudly before a cynical 1886 Colorado pawnshop, weathered mountain miners profoundly embody the remarkably brutal, desperately hopeful economic survival, violently defining late 19th century America's endlessly unforgiving, treacherous mining frontiers. Erupting violently during the historic 1889 Oklahoma land rush, desperate pioneering settlers spectacularly unleash an unstoppable, chaotic human tidal wave, profoundly symbolizing America's terrifying, ruthlessly overwhelming territorial expansion consuming indigenous lands. Bustling beautifully with heavily burdened donkeys alongside rustic wooden facades circa 1890, Santa Fe's dusty streets profoundly immortalize the fading, captivatingly authentic cultural soul deeply defining America's ruggedly unforgiving Wild West.